In this video, I am going to focus on how to use vSAN commandlets or vSAN PowerCLI commandlets to make certain configuration changes on your vSAN cluster. So most of the settings of the vSAN cluster can be altered or controlled using the PowerCLI commandlets, provided we know exactly which settings or parameters to use. So let's take a look at few of those examples. So one of the simple things which we can do using a PowerCLI commandlet for the vSAN cluster is to start a proactive rebalance of the cluster. So for this we have a commandlet called Start-VsanClusterRebalance. So as with all other commandlets in PowerCLI, the commandlet name itself is pretty descriptive and self-explanatory. So this commandlet starts the proactive rebalance of the vSAN objects on the cluster hosts based on the disk usage. So this proactive rebalance usually can be launched using the graphical user interface, but suppose you want to do it in a script where you maybe want this to happen automatically, or maybe you want to apply this to a number of vSAN clusters, then we need this commandlet to make that happen, in an automated fashion. So let's take a look at what the output looks like. So I ran this command Start-VsanClusterRebalance, and as usual I passed in the parameter as the cluster object. So the cluster object should be the parameter, otherwise the commandlet does not know which vSAN cluster it applies to. So once it runs this commandlet, you will get a confirmation prompt. So it will ask you whether you want to start the rebalance as yes or no. So once you say yes, as you can see, it has started the rebalance. And you can even go to the user interface or the vSphere client, and you can see that the proactive rebalance is in progress as of now. At any point, if you want to stop the proactive rebalance, then there is another very descriptive command, the stop vSAN cluster rebalance, and you pass in the name of the cluster. It will immediately stop the cluster rebalance operation. So this is one of the simple tasks you can perform using PowerCLI. Let's take another example, which is the vSAN cluster disk update. As usual, it's the name itself is quite self-explanatory. So this commandlet starts the update of all the vSAN disks to the latest vSAN disk format. This commandlet has one condition or one caveat. It is that the disk autoclave mode should not be automatic, so it should be set to false. So the automatic autoclave mode should not be enabled on that vSAN cluster. Otherwise this commandlet will fail. So this is another of the commandlets which you can use for changing the settings of the cluster. Another very important commandlet which we can use to change any kind of setting on the vSAN cluster is the Set-VsanClusterConfiguration. So this is like you can say a Swiss Army knife command which you can use to change any of the properties of the vSAN cluster. So let's take a careful look at the syntax on how it works. So first what I do is I'm running the Get-VsanClusterConfiguration for that particular cluster, my vSAN cluster, and I'm storing the result in this variable called vSanClusterConfig. The vSAN cluster config now contains the settings of the entire cluster. Now if I pipe the vSAN cluster config and I say select object performance service enabled, so which means I am just want to see if the performance service is enabled or disabled. So the output is not shown here, but here the performance service was originally disabled. Now if you want to enable the performance service programmatically using the PowerCLI commands or using a script, so there the Set-VsanClusterConfiguration cluster configuration command will need to be used. So what I'm doing here is Set-VsanClusterConfiguration, and with the configuration parameter I have to specify the configuration of the cluster which was stored here, and I will just say performance service enabled $true. So which means I'm setting the performance service enabled to true. Once I run this command, and if you look at the next screen or look at the output here, the performance service was initially, it was not enabled, so performance service enabled was false. After we ran the command, the performance service enabled is now true. So this is just an example of the Set-VSAN cluster configuration, how it can change the settings of the vSAN cluster. So I'm just giving one of the properties which I have changed. Like this, there are so many other properties for the vSAN cluster which can be manipulated or changed using this Set-VsanClusterConfiguration commandlet. So obviously this is a very important commandlet to remember. Another very common task which we usually perform on vSAN clusters is creating storage policies, deleting storage policies, modifying storage policies, or applying storage policies to the virtual machines. So these are some of the common tasks which are required to be done by the vSAN administrator on a regular basis. So let's look at a case study here where there is some requirements for the policy management, and let's try to see how we can meet these requirements by automation using PowerCLI. So here are the requirements in this particular company or in this particular environment. So many different policies need to be created. So there is a requirement that each and every department of this company should have different storage policies, and the policy creation should be scripted to avoid manual work by the administrator. So this is one of the kind of requirements from the management side, that maybe the administrators are overloaded with their daily tasks. So the policy creation should be something which is automated, so the administrator does not have to go to the user interface and click on the different settings to configure the policies. So it should be configured using PowerCLI. And there is another requirement that the vSAN administrator should be able to apply these policies to tens or hundreds of virtual machines at the same time. So as you know that if you want to do it from the user interface, it might take you a considerable amount of effort, and it might take up unnecessary time for the administrator. So let's see if all this can be done using PowerCLI commandlets. So if you look at the solution, there are a particular set of commandlets provided by PowerCLI for vSAN which will meet our requirements. So these commandlets are the New-Spbm rule commandlet, the New-Spbm rule set, and the New-Spbm storage policy. So these are the three critical commandlets which are required for storage policy management. And to apply those storage policies to the virtual machine, we have only one command, which is the Set-SpbM entity configuration is the commandlet which we need to use there for applying the policies to the virtual machines. Let's take a look at how to use these commandlets in the field. So first of all, what I'm trying to do is to run this command, get command, and find out what all SPBM commandlets are available. So I'm doing a get command, and I'm searching for the keywords SPBM and vSAN. So as you can see in the bottom, you have the few of the SPBM policy related commandlets, and on the top you have a few other SPBM get SPBM entity configuration, or I think the set related commandlets have been truncated here. Nevertheless, we are going to use that commandlet for applying the policy to the virtual machines. Let's look at how to create the policy before we can start using the policy for the different virtual machines. So creating the storage policies actually requires three different commandlets and three different steps. So all these three steps are mandatory if you want to create a storage policy using PowerCLI commandlets. So starting, you will have to create a rule. So for that we need to create this rule using the New-Spbm rule commandlet. So once we run the New-Spbm rule commandlet, and here I am specifying the parameter and saying a capability, and I am giving one of the capabilities of vSAN. So here I create a rule. In the second step, I am using the commandlet called New-Spbm rule set. When I am using the command New-Spbm rule set, I am actually attaching the rule which I created in the first line. If you see the last, the end of this particular command, you will see that I am attaching the rule which was created by the first commandlet. And finally, there is the third commandlet which ties all this together into one storage policy. So I am running the command New-SpbmStoragePolicy. I am naming the policy as testpol1, and I say any of rule sets, and I am specifying the rule set. So please remember, the rule set was created here in the last command. So as you can see, it's a 3-step process, and this is mandatory for creating the storage policy. So as you can look at the output here, now the storage policy testpol1 has been created, and what remains to be done is to apply the storage policy to one of the virtual machine, which is very simple, which just takes one step. So here I have got a virtual machine called vSAN VM1, which I am going to kind of store it in an object. So I say get VM with the name of the virtual machine. I'm storing it in a variable called vSAN VM, and then I just pipe in the virtual machine, and I execute the commandlet set SPVM entity configuration, and I specify the storage policy testpol1 as the parameter, and that is all that is required to be done to kind of attach the storage policy to the virtual machine. So if you just see the kind of utility of this exercise, suppose if I want to apply this storage policy to 10 virtual machines or 50 virtual machines at the same time, it can be very easily done using PowerCLI. However, if we need to do the same task using the graphical user interface, it might involve a considerable amount of effort on our part to do that. So in this video, we kind of looked at a few of the configuration settings which can be done using PowerCLI commandlets for vSAN, and we also saw the process by which we can create storage policies and apply storage policies to the virtual machines, and this might help in reducing the administrative burden or the administrative tasks of the vSAN administrators to a great extent if all these tasks can be automated using PowerCLI commandlets. In this video, I am going to talk about troubleshooting a vSAN cluster using PowerCLI commandlets. So when it comes to performing any kind of troubleshooting with your vSAN cluster, we commonly use the RVC console. So that RVC console has traditionally been used to perform troubleshooting because it allows us to pull out a lot of detailed information about the vSAN cluster, particularly the disks or the disk groups and many other detailed information. However, it is also possible to pull out the same level of detail using the PowerCLI commandlets, and once you know how to pull out that information, it is going to be very useful to perform any kind of troubleshooting or try to figure out what exactly is wrong with your vSAN cluster. So I'll just present another case study here. So for example, there is the company here where vSAN clusters are deployed, and Mr. Jones is the administrator for that company, and so he is asked to perform some troubleshooting on his vSAN clusters. and most of the time he is kind of required to go to the RVC console to pull out the required information regarding the disks or the disk groups. So he wants to know whether that same information can be obtained using PowerCLI commandlet, since he is a very big fan of using PowerCLI. So he would like to know if those information can be obtained using PowerCLI. And the good news is that indeed we have some PowerCLI commandlets which can provide you with very detailed information about the cluster details, like particularly the disks and the disk groups, which can help in the troubleshooting. So these commands are appropriately named as the Get-VsanDisk group and the Get-VsanDisk command. So in this coming slides, I am going to try and demonstrate how these commands can be utilized to pull out detailed information about the disks and the disk groups. So suppose you want to kind of get information on a particular disk. To narrow down to that disk, you need to follow a sequence of steps. So this involves using the Get-VsanDisk group to get the disk groups first. So before you can narrow it down to a particular disk, you need to look at the disk group. Next, you can note down the disk group ID, and then you can run the Get-VsanDisk and use that particular disk group ID to get the appropriate information. So before we can start doing that in the coming slides, first of all we'll have to get the cluster information itself, which is pretty much common in all our exercises. So we'll have to run get cluster with the name of the vSAN cluster, and I'm storing it in a variable called $cluster. So this is basically my reference point, which contains the cluster object. So next I start off with trying to find out what are the disk groups which are part of my vSAN cluster. For doing that, I'll simply go ahead and run this command Get-VsanDisk group with the cluster name, and I'm going to select some of the properties which I'm interested in. So in this case, I'm going to select name, the ID of the disk group, the host which the disk group belongs to, the disk group type, and the disk format version. So these are the properties I'm interested in as of now. So as you can see that it has given the disk groups for all the hosts in the cluster. I am particularly interested in the disk group on the ISCSI 4. So I will note down the disk group ID here. So basically I have to make a note of this particular disk group ID so that I can use it in the further commands to kind of pinpoint that particular disk group and further pinpoint the particular disk which I want to look at. So once I have noted down the disk group ID, the next thing which I am going to do is run the Get-VsanDisk group command against that particular disk group ID. So here what I am doing is Get-VsanDisk group, and I am specifying the ID which we noted down in the last step. So this is the disk group ID which we noted down, and I'm going to store the result in a variable called my disk group. So now that I have obtained the particular disk group which we want to look at, what I am going to do is I'm going to kind of pull out all the information about that disk group. So for doing that, I am going to type in my disk group and pipe it in to the select command, and then I'm going to select the properties which I am interested in. So what are the properties I'm interested in? I'm interested in the name, the ID of the disk group, the VM host, disk group type, and the disk format version. So I'm pulling out all those details. Now in the next step, I am going to run the command Get-VsanDisk, and I am going to run this for this particular disk group. So let's see how I am doing that. So I run the command Get-VsanDisk, and I'm specifying the parameter vSANDisk group, and I'm specifying the my disk group which we got in the earlier command here. So basically I'm trying to obtain all the disks which are part of this particular disk group. So here the output has been truncated. In the next slide, we will see the complete output. So here we see the complete output. This is showing all the disks which are part of this disk group. So I am focusing on one particular disk here. So the top one. So this this is the cache disk. So if you see, the is cache disk flag is set to true. So if you look here, the flag which is called is cache disk. So this is the cache disk for this particular disk group. So this is the disk which I am interested in, because for some reason this disk has gone bad, or there is a particular problem with this disk, and I want to look at the details of this particular disk. So I am going to focus on this disk only. How to focus on this disk, or to get the particular information of this disk, I am going to use a parameter called the canonical name. So if you see, there is a kind of a property called canonical name, which is mpx.vmhba1 :c0t0l0. So this is the name which I am interested in. This is the canonical name of that particular disk. So next I am going to use the Get-VsanDisk only for that canonical name. So let's look at the command. So the command is pretty much self-explanatory. I am looking at Get-VsanDisk for this disk group, the my disk group, and I pipe it onto the where object, and I am filtering it only for that canonical name. So as you can see how I'm trying to narrow it down to one disk only, and then I pipe it to format list, which will give me all the properties of the disk. Now you can see that I have got all the information for that particular disk which I might have needed. So everything is available here. Any kind of information I need for troubleshooting purposes, or if I want to look at the logs and I need some particular reference property, I can use the output here, and this is pretty much gives you all the information I might need for that particular disk for my troubleshooting purposes. Another commandlet, or which we can employ for kind of monitoring or troubleshooting purposes, is the Get-VSAN resyncing component. So this is one more commandlet. So basically this will just show you the resync dashboard, where if there are resyncs going on in your cluster, so those you can monitor, and you can watch them, or see how much data remains to be resynced. So basically in this video we saw a few of the disk related commands like Get-VsanDisk and Get-VsanDisk group, which are very useful in finding out information about a particular disk or disk group, and we can go and dig down and find out as much detailed info as we need. Other than this, we have a few other commandlets like Get-VSAN object, which also gives us an object level view of all the vSAN objects in the environment. So using these vSAN commandlets, the PowerCLI commandlets for vSAN, we can actually get a lot of detailed information about the disks, the disk groups, or the vSAN objects. And if you want to perform any kind of troubleshooting operations, these PowerCLI commandlets will prove to be very, very useful. In this video, let's talk about how to configure ISCSI LUNs on a vSAN cluster, and how to provision those LUNs to the clients. So we are going to perform all these operations using PowerCLI, and without taking the help from the graphical user interface. So before we get started with this exercise, we have a small case study here where we have this a company with a particular set of requirements which we are going to try and solve using PowerCLI for vSAN. So let's look at this company A, which has a test dev environment, and in this test dev environment, or let's say it's a development environment, they have a requirement of deploying a lot of SQL and Exchange servers, and all these SQL and Exchange servers they require ISCSI LUNs, and since this is a test and development environment only, so these servers are brought up and they are deleted quite frequently, which is causing a lot of administrative burden on the vSAN administrators, because they have to provision LUNs on the vSAN cluster for these hosts, and they might have to delete them and reprovision them again. So they are kind of trying to automate those tasks. That is the pretty much the scenario here. And if you look at some of the requirements, so the vSAN administrator will be requested to provide new ISCSI LUNs for the new test development servers whenever they are deployed. So this is, since this is a development environment, it's a very dynamic environment where we need to provision these LUNs frequently. And the task of configuring and provisioning new ISCSI LUNs should be automated as much as possible, as this task will be repeated very often. So these are the requirements for this particular case study, and so we need to figure out how to kind of involve or insert PowerCLI commandlets into the equation, so that we can automate these tasks as much as possible. So first of all, our the target would be to kind of find out what are the commandlets which can be used here, which will make our task easy. So we have a few PowerCLI commandlets like new vSAN ISCSI Initiator group, new vSAN ISCSI Initiator group target association. These are just the examples of few of the commands we are going to use to create ISCSI targets and associate those targets to the new let's say SQL hosts or the new Microsoft hosts. So this is what we are going to do in the coming slides. So let's get started. First of all, let's have a brief overview of the steps we are going to follow here. First of all, we'll need to enable the ISCSI target service on the vSAN cluster. So in my lab environment, I have not yet enabled the ISCSI service, so we'll need to enable that. Then we'll need to add an ISCSI target. So in this case, the ISCSI target is going to be on the vSAN cluster, and there is a kind of a Microsoft host like a SQL server will connect to this target. So this target will be part of our cluster. Then we'll have to add an ISCSI LUN. So the LUN will be kind of mapped to the client or the SQL host, and so the LUN should be visible to that host. So we'll find out how to do that. And then we'll create an initiator group. So initiator group is the Microsoft host which is going to connect to this target service. So for that we need to create an initiator group, and finally we'll add the required hosts to the initiator group, or add the members to the initiator group. Here the members mean the Microsoft servers which are going to connect to this environment. So those will be the members of the initiator group. So let's get started by enabling the ISCSI target service. So the vSAN ISCSI target service is disabled by default. So we need to enable that. To enable that, we have to follow a simple PowerCLI commandlet, which is the Set-VsanClusterConfiguration. And using the Set-VsanClusterConfiguration, I am passing the vSAN cluster name as the parameter, or the vSAN cluster object as the parameter, and I am just using this parameter called ISCSI target service enabled, and I am marking it as true. So this is the step which we need to do to enable the target service. And when you are enabling the ISCSI service, it is also mandatory to specify a VM kernel port which is going to use. So the default ISCSI network interface, here I am specifying it as VM kernel 2. So after I run this command, you can see if you go to the vSphere client, you will see that the vSphere target service is now enabled, and the default ISCSI network is associated with VMK2. So we have accomplished our first task. So let's move on there. So now we'll add an ISCSI target. So to add an ISCSI target, we have another command or another commandlet which we are going to use, which is the new vSAN ISCSI target. So the name is obviously descriptive enough, and I'm providing a name for this target, which is ISCSI Target 1. This is entirely up to me what I want to name it. Then I'm specifying the parameter called the cluster, which is nothing but my vSAN cluster. I'm specifying the network interface as VM kernel 2. So this is all the information that is required to create the new ISCSI target. So once I run this command, you can see that the output shows that the ISCSI target 1 has been created. If you look at the vSphere client, you can also see here the same thing. The ISCSI target 1 has been created here. It has got this IQN, and it is associated with VMK2. So this, we have created the ISCSI target, so which was our next step. After doing that, we also need an ISCSI LUN. So the ISCSI target is basically useless without having a LUN, which is going to be exposed to the hosts or to those Microsoft servers. So for creating the ISCSI LUN, there are two steps. It's a two-step process. First, I'm going to run the command Get-VsanDisk ISCSI Target, and I'm going to store the ISCSI target 1 in this variable called $target. And then in the next step, what I'm going to do is I am going to execute the command new vSAN ISCSI LUN, and I'm going to call it vSAN LUN 1. I'm going to specify the target as a $target, which I created in the previous step. I'm going to mark the LUN ID as number 3 and the capacity as 2 gigs. Since I have a small environment, I'm just creating a 2 GB LUN for testing purposes. So you can see the output here. Once I run this command, you can see the vSAN LUN 1 has been created. LUN ID is number 3, capacity is 2 GB, and it is online and associated with ISCSI target 1. So this is very important. The LUN has to be mapped to the target. I'm kind of trying to verify the same thing using the user interface. So in the vSphere client, I now go and see that the vSAN LUN 1 has indeed been created, and so it is kind of at this point available to everyone. Okay, next step, as we have seen in the list of steps, we have to create an initiator group. So just to reiterate, the initiators are the external servers which are going to connect to this target, and those servers can be made part of an initiator group. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to execute this command, new vSAN ISCSI initiator group. I'm calling it group 1. And I'm going to configure it on this vSAN cluster. So after I execute the command, I see the result here, group 1 has been created. So the next step is to associate the ISCSI initiator group with the target. So this is a very important step which we cannot miss. So this means that the members of this initiator group should have access to this target. To create this association, we need to run this command called new vSAN ISCSI initiator group target association. I would say this is probably one of the longest commandlet names I've come across. So we run this long commandlet, which I'm not going to try and read once more. And then we specify the initiator group as the initiator group which we have already created, and the target as the target which we already created. And after we run this command, the association command, we see that the group 1 is now associated with ISCSI target 1. So this is a very important step which is required so that the initiators can talk to the targets, or talk to the target rather. Finally, now that we have done all the settings, we have created the target, we have created an initiator group, we have created the ISCSI LUN. However, the initiator group is currently empty. We have not added any Windows servers to that initiator group. So in this final step, I am going to add a Windows server to that initiator group so that it can get access to the target, and via the target it can get access to the ISCSI LUN. So let's see what command we need to run here. So the command which is required is Set-VsanClusterRebalance ISCSI initiator group, and then I specify the initiator group object, and I specify a parameter called add initiator, and after the add initiator I am kind of adding the ISCSI initiator for that Windows machine. This value which you are seeing here, that is the IQN value for that Windows server, this you need to get from that Windows server machine. So on the Windows server machine you have to log in and find out the initiator, the ID for that machine, and then you need to paste it here for this command to work. So once I have executed this command, now this particular initiator, this IQN for that for that Windows machine has been added to my initiator group, which simply means that now my that Windows machine will have access to the vSAN ISCSI target, and it will be able to access that particular LUN which we have assigned to the target. So this pretty much completes the setup for the ISCSI configuration for a Windows host. So using these PowerCLI commands, we saw that we can create the target, we can create the initiator group, we can create the ISCSI LUN, and we can add the Windows hosts to that initiator group so that the Windows host can get access to that ISCSI LUN, and you can use it for storing the data which is required to be stored. In this video, I am going to discuss a few of the advanced concepts related to PowerCLI and vSAN. Particularly we'll be actually trying to access the vSAN API itself using PowerCLI, and for doing that we'll be using a particular commandlet called Get-VsanView. So let's take a look at how we can access the vSAN API using this commandlet. So let me just briefly introduce you to the vSAN Management API. So what exactly is this vSAN Management API, and how do we use it for our automation purposes? So the vSAN APIs are an extension of the regular vSphere APIs. So you might be already familiar that the vSphere Web Services API is allowing us the functions for PowerCLI automation. So similarly, when it comes to vSAN, we have another API called the vSAN API. So the vSAN API is exposed as a web service as expected, and it runs both on the vCenter and the ESXi hosts. So this API provides you with all kinds of methods and properties in which you can access vSAN or perform various kinds of management operations with vSAN. The vSAN API was first introduced with vSAN 6.2. and it can be used for a variety of different automation purposes, like for example management, like install or upgrading vSAN or patching, or it can be used for monitoring or configuration as well as troubleshooting. Starting from vSAN 6.6, the API has been expanded further, and it now provides more integration with PowerCLI, and we can access almost all the API functions using PowerCLI. So let's proceed on how to access these API functions using or API functions and methods using PowerCLI. To start this process, first of all, we'll have to kind of get ourselves familiar with a particular commandlet called Get-VSAN view. So in this example, I am running this Get-VSAN view commandlet, and without any kind of parameters. So I have it is connecting to the vSAN cluster which I have in my environment. So once I kind of run this commandlet, you will see that there are a number of items which are basically the various managed objects which comprise the vSAN API. So you'll see that for every aspect or feature of vSAN, there is a separate managed object, so which contains that kind of functionality of the vSAN. So a few of the different objects which you can see here, if you look at the list or the third or the second column here, you see the vSAN Performance Manager, vSAN VCSA Deployer System, vSAN Update Manager. So almost all the aspects of vSAN are covered here. So for this particular exercise, or for this video, I'm going to focus on one of these managed objects, which is basically handling the configuration of the vSAN cluster. So I'm going to focus on the particular managed object called the vSAN VC cluster configuration -vSAN -cluster -config -system. So as this name indicates, this managed object contains the configuration details of your vSAN cluster. So to pull out the information from this managed object, we will be applying different PowerCLI commandlets, but just bear with me here, because these commandlets have a slightly more complex syntax. So we'll try to understand it step by step. So let's take a look at what are the different things we can do with this particular managed object. So we can enable or disable vSAN using this particular object. We can enable or disable the autoclaim mode. We can enable or disable the data efficiency feature, that is the deduplication or compression features. We can manage the disk groups. We can manage the fault domains, and we can retrieve the information about the vSAN cluster. So the last 2 points where we talk about retrieving the features about the vSAN cluster, these are the ones which I'm going to demonstrate here. So I'm not going to go into the ones which are actually going to make any changes. I'm going to focus on these last two methods on how to get the information from the vSAN API about that vSAN cluster. So for doing that, as I suggested earlier, that this syntax is slightly tricky. I mean, it takes a little getting used to. So we'll try to see how it works exactly. So first of all, in the first line, I'm running the command Get-VSAN view. And instead of running it without any parameters like we did last time, I specify the ID, and I'm specifying this particular managed object which we are discussing, which is the vSAN VC cluster config system. So this is the object I'm going to focus on. So I specify this object with the Get-VSAN view, and I'm storing the results in a variable called vSAN config view. So vSAN config view variable now contains the configuration information about the vSAN cluster. So once I run this command and I pipe the vSAN config view to format list, you'll see that it is a object of this particular type, which is the one we specified, that is vSAN VC cluster config system. So we have stored that all that information in the vSAN config view. So let's make a note of that there. That's going to be our first step. There are a few other steps to come before we can actually get to the information we need. So in the next exercise, or in the next step, we are going to try to find the managed object ID of the vSAN cluster. So this is relatively simple. So all I do here is I kind of pull out the cluster object using get cluster with the name of the cluster, and I just access the property of that cluster, which is dot extension data dot moref or moref, which is the managed object reference or the managed object ID of the vSAN cluster. So I'm now storing the managed object ID in this variable called cluster underscore MOID. So I have now stored the MOID of the cluster. So this is the step number 2. Now in the next step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to access one property of the variable vSAN config view. If you remember, in the first step, we stored all the cluster information in this variable called the vSAN config view. Now I'm going to, invoke a method on this variable. This method is called vSAN cluster get config. So if you want to know more about this method, you can just access the documentation. It will tell you about the method. So that is what I did. I first went through the documentation and then I invoked this method, and this method requires the cluster MOID as the parameter. So I in the bracket I put in the cluster MOID. So what happens now is that my entire data or entire information about the cluster is stored in a variable called vSAN config results. So vSAN config results is the final output which I want, in which I have all the information I need. If I do a vSAN config results pipe get member, it will show me what are the methods and properties of that variable. If you see, it has all the properties related to the vSAN cluster. For example, the data efficiency config, data encryption config, data store config, default config, extended config, ISCSI config. Everything about the vSAN cluster is available in the form of properties. So once we know these properties, what are the properties of this object, it's relatively easy for us to pull out the information which we need for our intents and purposes. So here I'm pulling out a few of the properties like vSAN config results dot data efficiency config. So if I pull out this information, it tells me that the dedupe or deduplication is not enabled on this cluster, which is false. I am also going to look at another property called the extended config, which provides me more details about the vSAN cluster. So if I look at the results, you see it was showing me the various advanced properties like object repair timer or disable site read localities. These are the extended properties or the advanced settings of the cluster. So as you can see, it's once you are familiar with the syntax, it is relatively easy to pull out all the cluster information using the API itself, using this particular PowerCLI commandlet. So if you as you can see that these APIs or the methods, it is not straightforward or simple to use. So if you really want to do some kind of automation where you need to use these methods, so it is highly recommended that you go through all the documentation first rather than trying to just guess at it. So the documentation is available here in this location. It has an in-depth description of all the methods and properties, which will help you in using these Get-VsanDisk view commandlets to get the relevant information. In this video, we looked at some of the advanced concepts of using PowerCLI with vSAN, and particularly we saw how we can access the vSAN management API using the Get-VsanDisk view commandlet. So in normal cases, you might not be required to do this. You might be able to get away by just using the vSAN specific commandlets, but in certain scenarios where the commandlet is not available, the relevant commandlet has not yet been developed, and you want to perform some kind of automation where you need to invoke methods or access properties directly in the vSAN management API, then the best way to do it is using the Get-VsanDisk view commandlet, and you might find it to be very useful.